All right, good morning, everyone. It is 9:02 on Thursday, April 4th, and I'll call this meeting of the Community and Economic Development Committee to order. I am Chair George Martinez, and I'll ask members for introductions.
Daniel Fuller.
Karen Bronca. Anna Brawley.
On the phone,
Zach Johnson.
thank you, Mr. Johnson. Okay, there are no other members on the phone. Thank you all. And I'll just remind folks who are going to be talking and speaking with us today, if there are any questions and from staff or not, for any other person to speak, just introduce yourself before you speak, so for the record. And today we have a pretty short agenda, but we do have some updates that I want us to walk through with respect to our legislative priorities for 2024. So I will leave some time for that. And we'll open up with the first unfinished item, which is on our agenda, item A, 3 and 4-plex expansion, update on amendment. I know that it mentions, it has Mr. Ross here. I think Mr. Ross is prepared to answer any questions that members may have with respect to the 3 and 4-plex expansion updates. But if there's anything at the top to just give us as some guidance from Mr. Ross, it would be a perfect time.
Russ Thompson, acting building official. So the ordinance is in place. I think we've only had one fourplex submitted for permit this year, at least that I've seen come in. And when that fourplex came in, we realized that we had an issue with the permit fees. There's a weird thing between residential and commercial permit fees where, like, if you're below 3,000 square feet, the residential formula is cheaper. And if you're above 3,000 square feet, the commercial formula is actually cheaper. And so most fourplexes are going to be above 3,000 square feet, as this one was. It's like 4,500. And it's like, oh, this didn't meet the intent of the assembly. And the permit fee actually went up if we calculated based on the residential fee structure. So on March 14th, I shot an email to Dean explaining it and proposing how to correct it.
Yeah, Mr. Vaughn?
Do we have any update on amending the design criteria manual when it comes to the drainage? If we were to base it off of the disturbed area of the lot rather than kind of the units?
Greg's not in here today. I think the manual didn't necessarily need to be amended. It was more of a business process in terms of what was going to be required so that the private development review was satisfied that the drainage was going to work.
Yeah, I think my recollection is it did take an update of the DCR. So
Okay.
maybe we can pick that offline.
Yeah, that's Greg Soleil's area. He's not in right now.
Can you share about what the remedy is, or is it just a function of something that you all can fix in the background?
Oh, I probably shouldn't speak to that. I should probably leave that to Greg.
Okay.
Yeah.
But fundamentally, just what we heard is that an unintended consequence of a positive step forward, because the devil's always in the details,
Yes.
just needed to be ironed out so that the intent of the assembly to make expanding tris and fourplexes in Anchorage easier can be carried out.
Correct. The amendment in regard to the fee correction, proposed fee correction.
I heard something else, and I don't know if this is related to the tris and the fourplexes, but that there was another unintended consequence. I was meeting with Mr. Johnson and the home builders, and many other folks heard this as well. But that somewhere in the pipeline, there was a holdup of permits with respect to a new interpretation of a change that we made about some degree of a setback, a size setback for it's a technical thing that is probably really important at the technical level. From my vantage point as an assembly member, it's not so. It's the intent of what we're trying to accomplish to not have permits and holds is more important to figure out, well, what's happening. Do you know what I'm talking about?
That sounds like a land use issue. So.
Right off. Okay, can you just introduce yourself and help us understand what may be there and another unintended consequence?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank
Brian
you.
Yale, long-range planning manager. I believe the situation you're describing has to do with garage projections
in relation to the width of the non-garage portion of the street facing building elevation. We did identify that issue. We do have a fix for it, and it can be done through a floor amendment on the pedestrian frontage standards cleanup ordinance, which is going for the assembly next Tuesday. It's item 14A. And it's a purely technical amendment. It was previous language that we carried over and consolidated into 2 tables within Chapter 7 now. But when we carried that language over, we inadvertently missed a very important piece of it. So just reincorporated that previous language.
All right, so just for clarity, I identified, loosely identified, an area of some concern that was raised to us with respect to another unintended consequence or a part of the changes that needed to be made that just didn't necessarily align to the outcome that we wanted. That is not related to the tri and fourplexes, so I just wanted to be clear about that. But there was an actual issue there. You all have flagged it, and you have a resolution or a remedy for it coming to us.
Yes, that's correct.
And that's item 14A.
Correct.
All right, great. Are there any questions from members regarding that? Or any of the triplexes or fourplexes? Any other questions about that? We heard that there has at least been one.
I'll just,
Yeah.
okay, Mr. Chair, throughout, the planning department did work with myself and member Barali on one item pertaining to the triplex and fourplex ordinance. If folks remember, I brought forward an amendment that set the side setback based off of the size of the building rather than how many units. So there was a reduction from, in the original proposal, a reduction from 10 feet to 5 feet for the side setbacks. And I brought forward an amendment that said if the building area was over 5,000 square feet, then the side setback would have to be larger, remain at 10 feet. They have a cleanup coming to be a little bit more clear about that, and it's actually based off of the gross square footage.
Gross floor area.
Gross floor area. Because that's the intent, right, is that it would be, the setback would be impacted by the envelope of the building, how big the building is, and how many units it has. So that would be something forthcoming.
Okay. And that speaks to more units and opportunity to have more housing built using more space. One question I do have as just an outro, I guess, is what does it take if anyone has a light answer now, that'd be cool, but maybe we can think about it. What does it take to actually incentivize or create some reason in Anchorage, a flow and a momentum toward expanding actual triplexes and fourplexes? I mean, to hear that, we're making changes, people are hearing about this, it's a good thing. There's one in the pipeline that you've at least identified that you know of. Question I have is how do we help draw capital into the area of growth that we want to see, like this area of triplexes and fourplexes, considering how much time we've spent on it? Are there any suggestions about how we can incentivize and things that the Assembly could be looking at? And can we have some suggestions coming our way? Yes?
I mean, the fundamental problem we're up against is Anchorage is mostly built, right? And the areas, especially the areas of town that would be conducive to having triplexes and fourplexes, are mostly built. So I guess looking at it from the perspective of redevelopment, of how the Assembly or the municipality could encourage redevelopment of areas of town that are already built through tax structures or
Are there robust conversations in any, maybe it's a higher level conversation for Mr. Wilbur about that overlay of redevelopment in these types of areas? Because I hear redevelopment loosely, and I hear other housing questions loosely, but But loose is like scattershot, buckshot, right? You know, like we're trying to take down something. I want to have some more targeted focuses that take time to get to some outcomes. Is there any conversation like that specifically happening?
This is Lance Wilbur, Community and Economic Development Director. I think Ross has brought on a couple, the opportunities for private properties are in the redevelopment. I think in any properties that the municipality might have, we could encourage a particular type of development on those parcels, which are not very many in that area. But I've also talked with real estate, and I probably want to have some conversations with finance about sort of how to do that. But it's not just about us, it's about the market. We can put as much bait in the water as we want, but if no one's gonna bite, we gotta find out why. And it's just gonna be a market and a choice and location. So if you could, Mr. Chairman, give us some time to start thinking about, what we could do to entice it, as you suggested. It has been on my mind. Now we've got this thing, what do we need to do to encourage it? So you give us some time, I think we can come back to you in a month or two and just to let you know what's on our mind. And I also kind of, want to talk to the home builders, the people that are, see how a couple other folks that do this and find out what their hurdles are. I don't know if it's money, if it's rules, availability. So we're going to find out.
Thank you. And just to recap, I appreciate Mr. Wilbur giving us a sense of interest in that area of exploration, bringing together various parts, real estate, finance from the municipality into the discussion with both for-profit and non-profit private developers essentially out in the community. And I mentioned the meeting that I had with the home builders. I too brought this very directly and just described the idea of, what does it take to take down an opportunity, right? So we keep talking about like how you take down an elephant, and I've heard that metaphor, lots of different bites. Well, I'd like us to have targeted bites, not random bites. Like if we're gonna take this bite as an actual good jugular bite, what is the bites that are gonna help do this a little faster? So I appreciate the interest. And I see Linda Brawley, she's deferred first. Yeah, Linda Brawley.
Yeah, I think we know some of the answers are in the Housing Action Plan, and a lot of it has to do with making our permitting process more streamlined, which means there's a lot of inefficiencies in it. That's something that the Assembly really can't do. It's really a department function to redesign that process. The thing that we're going to talk about next is really looking at how to make things simpler to build. And then I know there's a lot of other rules that we've put into our code over the years that have made it, it's made a lot of development almost infeasible, is what we've heard from a lot of folks, including Cook Inlet, who have said they can't even build some of the things they recently built now because of recent rule changes. So, I think we're kind of working through the menu of stuff, I think. And the challenge with tax incentives, I think it's good, but one is selling it to the rest of the public who doesn't believe that that's even a good strategy, even though that's what a lot of cities do. And then just the reality that it still temporarily shifts the tax burden to other people, and so that's the conversation. If we're doing that, what strings do we put on that funding? And I know that's been a discussion. We have tax incentives now that people don't seem to use for the most part. So I think it's really just making what we have better and less of a problem.
Well, thank you, Ms. Brawley, and I'm looking forward to going further into that discussion during the next part of the presentation as well. Allie Hartman, staff member, you had something to say?
Yes, thank you. Hi, Allie Hartman. I am the communications director for the Assembly. I work in legislative services, but I'm going to take off that hat and instead wear a different hat. We're talking about the market, we're talking about infill development, and I have been really working hard to build a fourplex. I am very interested in building a fourplex myself. And I think that is representative of a group of people that want to invest in their community and do something good and use their money to invest it where we are. And so when we talk about companies or developers, I think that it's also important for you all as policymakers to make space for the potential what I might call like a small scale builder or somebody like me who just wants to put some time and energy into something like this. And so in my experience, as I've been trying to do this, there are a couple of barriers that are pretty specific. And so, Mr. Chair, since you asked, I thought I might throw them out. One of them, specifically as it relates to infill development, is that there are lot size coverage maximums that oftentimes get in the way of making something like a small multifamily building really feasible on the footprint of the lot. And so, off the top of my head, I want to say that in R2M it's either like 40 or 60%. And so that's one that's been butting up against when I look at a lot and think, oh, can I build something on it? Oh, this would be really cute. Well, the lot coverage, like maximum, gets in the way of that. So I think that that's an interesting opportunity in terms of Title 21 and land use to come back around to that question of dimensional standards as it relates to the footprint and the lot itself versus size and scale or like form-based standards. So just offering that as one example. The other one eludes me at the moment, so I should write it down and then send it to you. But that's the one that is really standing out as a barrier for my experience.
Thank you, Ms. Hartman and Alec. I appreciate and your feedback. Please share it with us and share it so that we can have. It's important both from a vantage point of you as a staff person being able to have that opportunity to share what you know, but also just the insight of like a real person. Right? And I think that's really important, and it is a good. I like to transition into the next part of our discussion because it may overlap with multifamily, right? So, but I don't want to have our staff under the gun of triplexes and fourplex discussion exclusively, but just the idea of home and still dreaming of making home. That's an important thing to be able to not lose sight of and to keep that kind of energy and the spirit alive in our community. Not just necessarily to acquire one, but to make a home. And make could mean different things could mean build as well. I appreciate that. Thank you. Yes, Ryan?
Yes.
And please speak up if you're in the back toward the front so we can record it on the tape. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. It's Ryan Neal, Long Range Planning Manager again. We do have we did complete a site access test fit report that we had working through its way and on base and should hopefully be on the addendum for Tuesday's meeting. That was a very targeted study that we did to test whether or not the new site access and pedestrian frontage standards created impediments inadvertently to 3 and 4plex development on small infill lots. We had a 5-member team, civil engineer, 2 landscape architects, an architect, and then two members of the planning department that were on that to create some concept designs to sort of see, have we created an issue or haven't we, and what recommendations can we do going forward for code amendments. Specific to lot coverage, we were able to demonstrate you could do a 7,900 square foot fourplex on a 7,500 square foot lot in compliance with code. So lot coverage didn't come into play there, didn't pose an issue. There's, of course, these are concept level drawings, but you can do it if you have favorable conditions. So we did also issue some main recommendations, and of those main recommendations, we are putting together some form amendments to specifically address those on Tuesday, so that we can nip that in the butt right away. But there are some other recommendations in there that we could address down the line that extended beyond 3 and 4plex. So it didn't really seem appropriate to put it into the ordinance item 14A on Tuesday, but we could follow it up with another ordinance title.
That's why I looked up for Mr. Vaughn.
So will the assembly be able to read that report in advance of Tuesday?
Yes.
So we can see those recommendations?
Yeah, we are really hoping to get some of the addendum. We submitted it on Tuesday through OnBase, so.
Okay, the report?
The report, yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, it should be an AI.
Thank you, Mr. Vaughn. Are there any additional questions from members? If not, we'll move on to the next item. Excellent. We'll move on to the next item. Thank you, Mr. Member Brawley. An update on the home initiative, and Member Brawley will give us an update. We are preparing the screen. We have a slideshow on our presentation here, and all of the documents will be published on and should be published on our website, so you can have access to them at home if you are not with us in person.
Yeah. Thanks everyone, and myself and Member Boland will speak to this. Meg Zelato couldn't be here today, but she's the other sponsor. Also, I'm looking at the title of this. This was a modified version of what we gave to Planning and Zoning on March 18th, so just to say it's not exactly the same, but we'll get that corrected. So if you can go to the next slide. So this is an update, and so basically we're not going to go through kind of the why, because we've talked about that. It's really more drilling down into the content of this proposal, but we also want to give just a brief update where we are, and then of course planning staff can speak to that as well. But what we really want to focus on today in the committee and have some discussion and feedback is, again, the content of the proposal, the dimensional standards changes, the broad idea, looking at these different zones. So that's really where we want to focus, but I also want to acknowledge there's some process issues we're working through as well. So the home initiative is predictable residential development by right. What that means is streamlining our residential zoning, bringing our zoning code more in line with our 2040 land use plan, both the land use designations and also the broad intent. There's a lot of language in there that says we want more compact housing, we want to make it easier to build housing, we want to see, quoting our comprehensive plan, an urban transition where urban neighborhoods, right, the ones with services close to transit, in theory water and sewer, have more density over time. So that's what we're trying to do, and to do that through our zoning code. You can go to the next slide. So just briefly, we'll cover timeline and then we'll get into the content. And Dana, just jump in whenever you want. So we introduced this ordinance back in the summer. It was referred to the Planning and Zoning Commission for a meeting in March 2024. Back then, in the meantime, we have worked on a draft ordinance that basically the 87S, the original ordinance, had the broad policy. It said, here's the 5 new zones that we're proposing. Here's generally what that would look like, but it doesn't address things like your setbacks, your lot coverage, like Ali brought up, things like that. And so what we also prepared is a much longer draft ordinance with all those details. And that's what we presented in our webinar on March 4th and have been really socializing around the community generally, in addition to the big picture. So we had our planning and zoning hearing in a work session on March 18th. The staff has prepared a report that has some detailed comments both on process and then some recommendations or kind of questions around the choices that we made for further discussion. So we'll bring those up as well. Where we are now, we're working through some procedural or kind of process questions. Is this a Title 21 text amendment or is it an area-wide rezone? We have differing opinions on that right now. The attorneys are the dean, our attorney, and the MOA attorneys are working through that. So that's a conversation we can have today, but I think it's still being worked out because regardless of what the process is, maybe if it ends up being that it is not what we believe it is, then we still want to talk about the content of this and really kind of, is this a good policy or not? Anyway, so we'll come back to planning and zoning on May 20th. I believe we have a work session scheduled for Monday, May 6th. If it's not on the notice sheet, it should be soon. So the Planning and Zoning Commission had questions and wanted a chance to kind of dive in more, as well as getting those process questions answered. So in theory, that means that the ordinance would, after Planning and Zoning looks at it, makes recommendations, decides what they want to do with it, they would move those forward, and then it would come back to the Assembly in, we have June right now, but of course that might be later depending on their action. So that's where we're at right now. And then in the meantime, we are doing a lot of public outreach. You can go to the next slide. I think it's, hopefully I kept it in there. Yeah, just to say, so we reached out to community councils and a lot of other groups and really said to everybody in the community, we would love to talk to you about this proposal. And so we did a webinar that's recorded, we did our planning and zoning hearing, but also, and I think I'm actually missing some meetings on there, but this is just documenting the meetings that we've had so far. Sometimes it's a brief presentation, sometimes it's more in depth or a special meeting, but just to say that's where we're at, that's where we are. I was at Spenard last night. I realized, like I said, I think we're missing a couple. We're talking to the Alaska Black Caucus this Sunday for their community conversation, and we have some other meetings scheduled. And we're still reaching out actively to councils to try to get on their agenda if possible. So next slide. So our general guiding principles, and this is really thinking about, okay, if we're taking, there's 15 residential zones now, if we're combining those down into 5, how do we make the decisions about, how tall something can be, what uses should be there, et cetera. So really what we looked at when looking at all of that is upholding the 2040 land use plan, making the code shorter, simpler, and focused on the intent of those plans. And then as we're looking at these different zones, if there's 3 different zones we're combining into 1, what standards should we use? And so what we did, generally speaking, is use the least restrictive standards in those zones. So for example, if one of the zones had 30% lot coverage and the other one had 40% lot coverage, we went with the 40% because it was less restriction on what you could build, essentially. So trying to move our zones into being more flexible within the boundaries of the comp plan and land use plan. We said, let's keep the good, functional, and low-cost parts of Title 21, so this is not a full rewrite, it's really looking at these zoning districts, and then make it easier to update and administer and be more flexible, because as we know, just the longer and more complex your code is, the more that it pulls in cross-references and other things, and it's hard to untangle, and I think we've seen that through the site access ordinance, to be honest, it's just when you have a complex system, it doesn't mean it's bad, but it means it just takes a lot more time. Next slide. And Dana, I don't know if you want to jump in on this one.
Well, I think what I'll just say here is, we have our publicly adopted documents that, all of my colleagues are aware of. The Anchorage 2020 comp plan, which is sort of the umbrella, the parent document, and then the land use plan, 2040 land use plan. I know you all are very familiar with that. And then those should drive the decisions when it comes to our Title 21 municipal code. One of the things that the sponsors are working on right now, and I know that you all are very familiar, often when we have a specific rezone, we'll have a concurrent update and an amendment to the land use plan, right, or comp plan. And so we do have a short list of amendments that we're going to be bringing forward very soon. We're going to send it to the planning department for their review first, and hope to get feedback. But yeah, we have a short list of concurrent amendments to both the 2020 and the 2040 land use plan.
Next slide, please. So we're not going to go through all this text, but just to say there's been some questions from the public, like what is the data around this, or what is the impact of changing zoning? And I think it's really a very active question in the profession right now, but there's a growing body of evidence because some of these proposals, this effort has really only been in the last few years, as we all have realized, in the planning profession and in the community at large, the impacts of mostly having single-family zoning on most of your land. It has restricted development. It doesn't mean that we should have high-rise apartments in every single property in our town, but it does mean that we have severely restricted where people can build housing and what they can do, and that has been found to be the case in a lot of cities, especially more suburban communities that surround metro areas. We are basically our own suburbs, and so we have that problem as well. Anyway, just to say there's actually more than this. We just really pulled a sampling of this evidence base. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're getting into more of the content. So how can home help address Anchorage's housing shortage? So this is not the only solution, just like 3 and 4 plexes wasn't, ADUs wasn't, parking, this is all really part and parcel of the bigger picture. But what we want to do is carry out the intent of our comprehensive plan, which says we want a variety of housing types and densities in safe, attractive neighborhoods. We want distinctive neighborhoods, and really we need more housing. And I think the land use plan really says many times we need compact housing, which in my mind is smaller units, less square footage, buildings closer together, and multi-unit properties, meaning condos, townhouses, whatever it is, that you can fit more living units on a parcel. So we're looking at gentle density. What that really means is just saying maybe a single-family neighborhood should have a few more duplexes, and that could be duplexes where you're subdividing an existing home. You've got a 2,000 square foot house. You want to subdivide it into top and bottom. Maybe it's a split level ranch. That's really not allowed in an R1 neighborhood right now. It doesn't change the footprint of the building. It doesn't even necessarily change the number of cars or people. It really depends on who's living in those units, as Daniel has said. but really looking at where that's possible, and really looking again at where, even if the zoning allows something in theory, then the other rules are not really making it feasible, to Ally's point about lot coverage, and that was really the whole point of the 3 and 4-plex work that's already happened. So we're looking basically at that principle in other zones. We also want to make sure that we're, as I said, we're using physical restrictions on property development where it makes sense. We want to look at the greatest opportunities for denser housing in our most dense existing zones. So really, you know, the plan talks a lot about we want more density in certain areas, and we really haven't seen that come to pass. And so we're saying maybe if we make those high density zones more flexible, more people would use them. Because what we've heard is, you know, for example, Cook Inlet Housing, one of our only multifamily builders right now, they build housing in B3 zones because it's more flexible than any of our residential zones. So that should really be a red flag, right? Why are builders who, you know how to use these codes looking at business zones? It's really the reverse problem of having business being built in residential zones. And then also looking at more by right housing. So again, how can we reduce the number of rezones needed, the number of variances needed, you know, all of those other pieces that require more process, that involves paying consultants to do that work, and then a lot of uncertainty of whether you're actually going to get, you know, what you had asked for, right? The uncertainty of going to the assembly for a rezone, right? Because there's been a pattern of basically something going for a rezone, and then the assembly or whatever body says, okay, that we'll do that, and we're going to add limitations to this property. So you have an R3 property, but you're only allowed to build X number of units. So really there's this issue of the process has not resulted in necessarily allowing more housing where in theory it should be. Next slide, please. So where we're going with this, again, is looking at the 2040 land use designations. And this is, I know we've presented on this before, so this is not new information, but just to refresh folks, this is a screenshot from the plan. If you could actually go to the next slide, just to say this is where those came from. So this is the proposal, and it is taking our existing zones, like we said, there's 15, and then as it says in the land use plan, that these corresponding zones would be the equivalent of the existing zones. And then Daniel, do you want to talk about the R2D?
Yeah, so one of the questions that we wrestled with is where is R2D, current zone R2D more appropriate? Should it go with the single family and 2-family residential designation, or should it go with the compact mixed residential low? It's found under both designations in the 2040 land use plan. R2M is also found under both the compact mixed residential low and compact mixed residential medium. But I think, you know, the more we looked at that and sort of the nature of R2D neighborhoods, I think the sponsors are pretty aligned in that it fits more appropriately into that single family and 2-family residential zone. And then when we look at R1, R1A, R2A, R2D can really be that model for that greater flexibility, those lesser restrictive standards that I was talking about for that category.
So we'll keep going because we actually have specific slides that show the dimensional standards for the current zone versus what we're proposing, so we can kind of get into and maybe talk through them one at a time. But we've got a couple more general slides, so we can go to the next slide. So this is a map. It's a modified version of the map, just coloring the things to look more clear. So we know where these zones would be because they're already on our land use map, essentially. And of course, we passed the land use plan in 2017. There have been changes to it, but there is obviously a current map that is maintained as the official land use plan map. And so really, if I live in an R2M zone, I could look at, I'm kind of squinting to see where my property is. So I know what my zoning would be because it would then be compact mixed residential medium. Next slide, please.
Actually, if you can see on this one just for a second, I like this visual because I think one of the fears or the criticisms that we've heard from some members of the public is that this puts the same amount of density everywhere. There's a scatter shot of density throughout the bowl. And you can clearly see that this is not true. I mean, look how much land we have in South Lake Creek that's designated as large lot residential, right? And I think when some members who may not be familiar with some of the dimensional standards in that area, they're very large lots. Right now, in one of the zones, you have to have 8 acres to have a duplex. So, large lot residential, and you can see all of the lighter yellow colors, the single family and 2-family. a lot of that area currently, you can only have a single family home. So the question is like, how much, if we have finite land left to do infill development, how much of that land are we willing to accept that it's just a single family home is the permitted level of development? Are we going to allow duplexes? But then you can still see closer to the more urban centers of downtown, Midtown, East Anchorage, those denser areas, and the opportunity for mixed use, right, for really vibrant, walkable communities. So there is a gradation of density that I believe follows the direction of the 2040 land use plan and the preferred scenario given by the Anchorage 2020 comp plan of that urban transition that it calls for.
And I'll just note too, I mean, you look at the map, I know we don't have neighborhood names up there, but I'm just looking where the red and the brown is, and it's near downtown, it's in Fairview, it's in Mountain View, it's in Russian Jack, and it's in Muldoon. And there's a few other places like down in Independence Park. Obviously, there's already mixed density there. And then I'll just note there's a bunch of gray on the map. That's really just non-residential uses, so it doesn't mean that there isn't things there. But we were really trying to highlight the residential zones because if you've looked at the land use map, it's a very pretty rainbow, but it can look very chaotic. So can you go to the next slide? So just a reminder, zoning districts have many components. So what we're talking about is the use table. So that's what you're allowed to build there as far as uses, lot coverage, setbacks, height. Those are really physical dimensions. In some cases, septic and slope obviously are issues, especially on the hillside. And then there's other considerations too. Transition if you're next to a lower density zone. All these other kind of pieces that are part of our zoning districts. Next slide, please. So folks have asked, what are the anticipated outcomes? Because what we've said is this is not going to instantly put, a fourplex right next to your house. It's not going to instantly change a lot of the kind of visual, look and feel of neighborhoods immediately. And it's not going to result in solving our housing problem tomorrow, because this is really a 40-year generational issue, right? How do we allow people to use our land? So zoning rules will shape development, obviously, but we won't see immediate changes. We are excited about the idea of potentially smaller minimum lot sizes, and I've used this example. So right now, a single-family home in most zones, has to be on a 6,000 square foot parcel. So if you own a piece of land that's 10,000 square feet, and in theory you wanted to subdivide that and want to build 2 single-family homes, so you want to double the density on that parcel, or you want to double the number of housing units, you can't do that because you can't subdivide to something that's smaller than 6,000 square feet. So I think there's some lots, 6,000 is the minimum. I think there's a fair number of parcels, and I know we've heard stories of folks coming in saying we want to do this. We want to be able to build a couple more units on our property. So this would allow that. So that's where, again, we're thinking about more efficient use of our land. Number 3, I kind of already covered, reducing rezones and variances because there's time and cost associated with that. And that's number 4. And then just to note as well, there's zoning, and then there's if you live in a planned unit development or a subdivision with an HOA. I live in a condo, so I'm in an HOA. Those rules also still apply. So for example, in Bayshore or Southport, those are planned communities. I believe in their covenants, or at least somewhere in the way that they've been developed, that they wouldn't necessarily allow subdivision to a duplex or those other rules. So those things would also apply. Same with ADUs. I think there's some neighborhoods that don't allow those. So we're not saying necessarily, and it's unfortunate for folks in Bayshore. It means that maybe you can't add another unit to your property, and that's just the way it is for that neighborhood. But for those folks who are not under those additional rules, this is still a possibility. Next slide, please. We're almost to the specific content. So Dana, maybe because we have some slides basically answering questions about if we make these changes, kind of what would that actually mean, or what would it look like?
Yeah. So one of the things that our ordinance envisions is allowing multiple principal structures on a lot. So on a lot that you'd be able to have a duplex, that could be an attached duplex, right, either up and down or side to side, or you could have a detached duplex where you have 2 smaller homes, but they don't share walls. In the denser areas, you could have multiple homes on a lot, which again is sort of what one of the types of housing that the 2040 land use plan calls for, cottage homes. This is on 11th and Cordova, built by a local developer, where they went through the unit lot subdivision process, and they were able to fit 5 homes on subdividing a lot. And it's in South Addition. When I look at this, I think it really fits the character of the historic South Addition neighborhood. But just allowing this type of creativity and flexibility, I think could make some really unique neighborhoods.
And just to add too, we got an email the other day from my friend George, who is a constituent, and he was saying, because he works in real estate, and he said, I like the idea of duplexes, but actually a lot of people in the market want their own little house, right? They don't necessarily want to share a wall. And so he said, it'd be great if we could do this. And I wrote back and said, yeah, this is actually in our proposal. So this is something that we know the market wants. And in fact, I think I don't remember how quickly these sold, but it was a pretty quick turnaround.
And I think at the time they were listed in the twos, and that was a while ago now. But even at that time, it certainly lower listing prices than average.
Just a question. So, why can't we, is there something preventing us from doing this today versus why could this happen?
Detached duplexes aren't currently allowed.
Except here. They were allowed here. This was like a year-long fight.
Unit lot subdivision, they had to go through the whole process to subdivide the lot. We are interested in how can we allow home builders, whether they're developers or just people who want to own or build, how can we allow them to do more of this by right? And a lot of the dimensional standards for that.
Emma Bronco?
Well, I'm looking at this and it really reminds me of Regal Mountain subdivision, which is on the corner of Tudor and Muldoon. And in '84, I think they went in, and I went and looked at one, and man, they were so skookum looking and brand new. And this wise realtor said, don't buy in here, they're too close, there's no place for people's toys, there's no place to park, it's going to be a mess in the future. And it really is kind of a mess right now. So I worry that we're not, in this kind of development, we're not thinking about how much stuff Alaskans have. Alaskans have a lot of stuff, snow machines, boats, big rigs. And I like that you're looking for solutions, but I really do worry about where, not everyone can afford to have a storage unit, and they're going to try to put their boat in front of one of these things.
Yeah, I guess I would encourage you to maybe visit this
I
development.
will.
Because it's really
And I would
cool.
encourage you to visit Regal Mountain.
Yeah, I would be happy to do that.
It's pretty
Yeah.
interesting what's happened there.
I will say, I think that this remains really beautiful, and I think fits into the neighborhood, but neighbors did have some of those concerns at the time. One of the things I think I would point us back to is the white paper that the planning department did presented to us at our housing summit that talked about people need different types of housing at different times in their life, right? And so perhaps a single working professional, something like this, a smaller home, they don't have as many toys. Maybe this would fit their needs. Or a retired couple who wants to downsize and has offloaded a lot of their toys. Maybe this would fit their needs. But yeah, I think we do need housing for large families, right, who have more stuff and need a place to store it. And so how can we have diverse housing types that meet the needs of various families or individuals in Anchorage? And I think having more flexibility to create those diverse housing types could be of benefit.
We have a question or comment from member Mr. Schutte. Just please introduce yourself.
Yeah, Chris Schutte, private consultant. So a comment and a question, and this is a great slide to frame that question within. So this is a unit lot subdivision, which is a very unique entitlement process, great innovative entitlement process that we've seen developers use to actually achieve greater, gentler density. And it works well, but it is an entitlement process that they go through to receive the quote-unquote benefit of being able to develop it this way. In the code as it's written today, unit lot subdivision is only usable in certain zoning districts. And so with the transition proposed at home, one thing for us to be aware of is what downstream impact would that have on some of these useful and flexible entitlement processes. And I don't have an answer, but I want people to be aware of that because there's a break, if I recall, in the eligible zoning districts for unit lot that I think is going to cross lines in the home new zoning hierarchy. So just something to look at. And then secondly, to Karen's point, very familiar with that neighborhood. I own property in and around that area. And those subdivisions were built at a time, much like we're experiencing now, when there was pressure to put housing units on the street as quickly as possible. And what we saw in the Molden Curve is two schools of thought. On the mountain side, we have Regal Mountain, which is very dense, right? It's a lot of great starter homes, and they have, frankly, some of the best access to the park anywhere in the state, in the city. But the amenity list is short or non-existent. So no garages, flat roofs in some of them. It is a little bit of a challenging neighborhood. On the inside corner, there were similar small lot subdivisions platted and built, but built with some of those amenities that Alaskans need. So just across Tudor, you have the same square footage units, maybe a few hundred feet bigger, same lot sizes, but you have 2-car garage built in, two bedroom, 2 bathroom. And they're shotgun style houses, so they're not super attractive. And they're very, very stacked on top of each other. But there is a way to design around the lifestyles of the customers you're trying to sell to. So I would point that out as you visit Regal Mountain. Be sure to go across Patterson area to see some of the other examples.
Thank you, Mr. Shute. I want to continue on the call.
Yeah, thanks. And I'll just briefly comment too. I mean, one way that we would allow this is not necessarily requiring a unit lot subdivision, but allowing more than one physical structure on the lot. So not, I think in most zones that would be allowed. So there's just different ways to slice that. And I guess I'll say too, I mean, when you're talking about folks who want a starter home, we bought our house for 4 people. It was built for 2 people, and so you make do with what you have, and that was what was on the market. So I think to Chris's point, I mean, we need to make, if there's nothing below a certain threshold that anybody can buy, that is a problem. And that's where we are now, and that's what we keep hearing. So I agree that maybe they're not the high amenity properties, but I think I was literally just talking to somebody last night who said, I'm renting a single family home in Eagle River. I would love to move into Anchorage. I cannot find anything at her price point, and that's just a reality. And so I think that, we've seen a lot of people are just stuck in the housing they have. It doesn't mean it's the best housing for their situation, their budget, etc. So next slide, we have a few more kind of broad, what would this look like, or what are the implications? Another one is allowing manufactured housing that's on a foundation in other residential zones. So currently they are allowed in R5. Obviously there are zones that allow mobile home parks, so a bunch of them. What we're talking about is if you own a piece of property, you could have a manufactured house on a foundation and not necessarily just a stick-built house. So that wouldn't mean that RVs are living units. And actually, it's interesting, this is something that the city of Valdez just did. I saw a presentation yesterday. They said they have 23% of their housing units are mobile homes, most of which are pre-1976 because of the way they were developed, which is the earthquake and then the pipeline 10 years later, right? So they have a very different housing mix. But they just allowed manufactured housing, including those pre-76 trailers, in all of the residential zones because their zoning code was so outdated. It was basically from the 1960s. So they just did an overhaul. This was a choice that they made. So what we're proposing is allowing, again, manufactured housing on a foundation, and it would still have to meet, of course, safety standards. So really just thinking about, and knowing that manufactured housing, the technology has come a long way. And so there's still challenges like the cost of transport up here, so it's not significantly cheaper, but it is an option for a lot of folks. And again, it's the best, well, I shouldn't say the best, but it's the cheapest, not subsidized option to have your own unit that you're not sharing a wall. So it's not for everybody, but a lot of people like these, and actually people prefer these to apartments in a lot of cases if they have that option. And certainly we know there's issues with mobile homes, but again, manufactured housing generally, I think there's a big spectrum of what that actually means, and so we're proposing allowing that and not just preferencing stick-built housing. So next slide. So this is looking at kind of the idea of one of the proposals is combining R3 and R3A, and then R4 and R4A. So those would still be two separate districts, but essentially combining what we have as our mixed-use districts, those ones with the A after them, with our higher density zones. And so just for clarification, these are the commercial uses that are allowed in R3A and R4A. And so these would also be allowed in our new zones. So there has been the planning department brought up an issue that currently in the mixed use zones there is a residential requirement. So that is something that we want to keep exploring is do we maintain a residential requirement? Do we just allow some commercial uses by right? Kind of the reverse situation of building housing in B3. But these are things that, for example, convenience store, personal services, food and beverage kiosk, things that that may be appropriate for a neighborhood. And I'm thinking of Fire Island Bakery. Every neighborhood that they've located in has been super popular, and people want those kinds of things. And so, how do we allow that? The other reality is what we've heard from developers is vertical mixed use is not feasible to build. So that means without significant subsidy. So the idea that you have retail on the first floor, apartments above it, your classic urban development, that is extremely difficult to build. There's a few examples of it that have been built here and have really struggled, especially to fill that retail space. And so this would allow what's called horizontal mixed use. Just the general idea that you could have housing and commercial in the same area, instead of segregating them and saying, okay, here's all of your neighborhoods over here, and here's all of your commercial areas, because that's basically why everybody drives everywhere, because you have to go several miles to get anywhere that you want to go. So this is part of that idea of having walkability.
There's a question on that. You referenced vertical mixed use and horizontal mixed use conceptually. Did you mention a study that you all are drawing from, or is there a resource material that speaks to those types of questions in terms of the choices?
I think it's really just the idea of, do you put it all in the same building, or do you have both buildings next to each other? Like the Fire Island example, it's its own building, but it's in a neighborhood, versus if you were saying the only way that you could do that is to build a building where you've got the bakery on the bottom and then you have to put housing above it. And if you talk to any builder, they will tell you it's just really difficult to finance.
Or Rustic Goat is a good example too, where you have the restaurant and some of the housing around it. So creating opportunities for that. Again, we're just pulling from, so the abbreviations there are compact mixed residential medium or urban high. So you could have a restaurant in either, but you could only have an amusement establishment in urban high. So that's just the consolidation, I guess, is allowing what's already permitted in the A zones, R3A or 4A.
Yeah, and you can go to the next slide. Because there's still, there's still several commercial uses that aren't allowed in R3A or R4A that still would be. So we're not changing the use table, essentially. We're just saying that these things would be allowed. So junkyard, although it's funny because I live down the street from a junkyard that's in a residential area now. Commercial food production, industrial uses. So there's plenty of things that, there's plenty of things that still would not be allowed. Because again, we're proposing changing zoning districts. We're not fundamentally reorganizing the entire zoning code or the logic of the zoning code. Next slide. Oh.
On that slide. Will there be a later conversation about commercial uses and the definition of certain commercial uses as it relates to this residential location? Sorry, let me just be upfront. Things like manufacturing aren't necessarily Detroit factories like we think they are. They're new things, yeah. And so at some point having a conversation around what commercial uses actually are and whether or not they would fit in a residential area would be worthwhile. I mean, I think Fire Island is a great example. That would be commercial food production. I think it's a great location to be next to residential units, but it would be not allowed under this. So just put a pin in that later, I guess.
Okay. Yeah, and that's really this. We're pulling this out as an area that I think we still need more work, because our default was just to say, okay, whatever, let's combine these. But I think that's a fair question. And actually, in Valdez, they found they had an extremely long, detailed, specific list of bowling. Like they basically had a list of uses that was that really covered some things and then completely forgot about other things, and so it was too specific. And then also they talked a lot about kind of home occupations and what that means, and how you separate things that have a lot of impacts versus things you can do at your house and not have those impacts. And so I think that's an interesting conversation that we can look at. But we did not dive into the whole use table, I'll just say that. Next slide. And we're almost through these two. So slope regulations, Dana, I don't know if you want to cover this one.
Yeah, I think this is really important. So in the staff report on the home initiative, I think, I'll just be frank, I think it was a little unfair because it seemed to infer that we are not taking natural hazards into account, and we certainly are. In fact, right now, so these are dimensional standards that kick in when you have, it only right now in the R10 district, when you have certain things like string slopes or bedrock challenges. Our proposal actually is to make these apply to all of the large lot residential zones. So we're actually being a little bit more broad. We're applying these safety precautions more broadly than they apply currently in code. So when you have these slope considerations or bedrock considerations, and there was a really interesting conversation when we took this to the Geotechnical Advisory Committee. They are working on a project where they're doing a lot of mapping of natural hazards, like slope or seismic. And one of the things that they were saying is, there's seismic considerations throughout Anchorage, not just in South Anchorage, but downtown has seismic issues in some parts of downtown. And so one of the questions I think really becomes, when looking to mitigate against natural hazards, whether that's seismic or slope or fire, or should any of those considerations be tied to a specific zone, or should they just apply wherever those dangers may be present? And so I think it's really interesting. It was interesting to hear about the work that the Geotechnical Advisory Committee is doing in regard to that. And I think that there's going to be a lot of opportunity in the future to sort of separate those hazards out from zoning and put them elsewhere in Title 21 so they can apply more broadly and protect safety and health, which for me, that is the original purpose of zoning. The original purpose of zoning is to not be exclusionary and say, you can only have these levels of housing development. The original purpose of zoning, I think in its purest form, is to separate residential uses from potentially harmful uses like industrial, etc., or when you have these potential threats to life and safety. So anyway, just want to point out that we are trying to make this apply more broadly, and I think that's something as we continue, as the Assembly looks to address our housing crisis and build in more parts of Anchorage, we should be looking to how we can protect health and safety wherever those issues arise.
Is your presentation almost to the?
I think we're all right on.
Yeah. And I'll just add too, this is a great example of something that's been in our code since the 80s, and it's really out of step with current practice and current technology because this was trying to solve that problem through a zoning district. What we have now is GIS. We have much more sophisticated hazard mapping. In fact, that's something the city has funding to work on. And so again, just decoupling the idea that you take care of those things in a zoning district and you're able to do it other ways. So let's go to the next slide. So this is a lot of text, but really it boils down what we saw as the key questions and issues raised in the staff report. So, because it is 33 or 36 pages, I forget. So the one set of questions was really around, as we said, the process, the consistency with comprehensive plan and land use plan. So that is really the bulk of what those issues are. And as I said, we're working through those. We do know that there need to be amendments to the plan, so we are working on that. What to do with low density housing areas. There's an interesting recommendation in there that says, the preservation of single and two family, really saying only up to a duplex, may not be enough to meet our housing needs. So there's a proposal in there to consider, for example, allowing 3 and 4plexes in more neighborhoods than beyond what is allowed now. So that's something we want to think about. Addressing physical hazards, we already talked about that one, and kind of we shared our proposal. Allowing commercial uses, we just talked about that one. And then really the question about compatibilities, and this is really, I think, gets to the heart of some of the language in the plans too, and kind of the assumptions in them, which is how much are we regulating people's property rights to accommodate the people around them, right? How do you balance the rights that you have to build your property, to have, for example, a duplex, and not just a single family home. So we're trying to also really introduce this idea of separating those kind of physical, environmental and hazard kind of discussions, that are valid things that we need to talk about, from the questions about economic impacts, perceived impacts to other people's properties, and then really aesthetics. When we talk about neighborhood character, we're talking about how a neighborhood looks and feels. That is important, but we should think about that differently than we do physical hazards, right? That we're not talking about a landslide because someone's house is not attractive, right? So really trying to separate those two things. Not because they aren't important, but we do need to think about them distinctly. Next slide. Okay, so now where we're going is, and we can either just have a broad discussion, but the rest of the slides are really, here's our proposal for the new zoning district, and then here is a side-by-side comparison of the new district versus the current district. So we can either go in the weeds or we can stay high level.
I would prefer to wrap up this. I think there's a lot to digest. I'd love to see if there's any additional questions or discussion, and then invite members to review this offline and follow up with folks if there are any questions with the sponsors. But at this point, are there any questions from members here? Member Braun?
I can continue looking at it, but one of the concerns that I'm sure you guys have heard is the height and the shading. And I had talked with someone in Rogers Park, and I'm like, I don't know why you're so worried. A lot of those houses are already duplexes and triplexes, and they just don't even know it. They're operating that way. But they had put a pretty large investment in solar, and we just did at our house. And they're worried of the height, and somebody deciding to do that, and now their solar is impacted greatly. Or if you have beautiful gardens, and I actually moved because of solar issues in my previous house in Wesleyan Drive. The people to the south had a huge tree forest, and we couldn't grow a garden, and so now, we moved to where there was sun. And so I'm hoping that we're addressing that height in these tighter neighborhoods.
Yeah, so in most of the consolidated zones, the building heights remain the same. And I think in single and two family, I want to say most of that is 30 feet. In fact, can we just go to?
Yeah, if we can go 2 slides ahead, that might, because I know, so basically the rest of the presentation is these. And so what we have at the top is the new zoning district proposed, and then all of the dimensional. So you can see kind of the variety that's there from those zones. But just to say, 40% lot coverage, if you look, the maximum height is still 30 feet, which is what every other zone has for the principal structure.
Now, in the denser areas, when we're combining R3 and R3A, R4 and R4A, some of those heights do go up a little bit. I want to say combining R4 and R4A means an increased building height of 10 feet, but those are where multifamily is supposed to be built, according to our plans. So at some point we have to decide we're going to build up, not out, because we don't have anywhere to go.
And I'll just add briefly too, so just to point out, under number of main buildings, that's the detached duplex. You'll see there's ones all the way down there that says you can have one principal structure. This would allow 2 principal structures. So that's what we're saying. It's not necessarily unit lot. And granted, this only still allows up to 2 units per property. And then the other thing to note, actually, so we worked on this, and we're looking at, what do we make choices with all these numbers. After that, I learned that really a lot of these numbers are at least from the 1980s. So this is 40-year-old stuff, and it was not changed. Most of it was not changed during the Title 21 rewrite. There were things added to the code. Most of this was not touched. And so we're looking at stuff that's been like this since as long as I've been alive, honestly. And so that's another question is, we've made these choices. Should we go higher with maximum lot coverage? Should we go smaller with setbacks in certain situations? Is that 20 feet? Is that being restrictive on some properties? I don't know. So that's a question we have. But just to say, these are things that have really not been touched for a long time. In fact, we found a comparison table that shows 2005 and it shows the old code and then this new proposed code before it was implemented, and it's literally it's the same for the most part. There are some changes, but not to most of these districts.
I believe Member Johnson dropped off the phone, so I don't think there's any questions from folks on the phone. Are you all pretty much at the conclusion? If I could just offer feedback, I would say the earlier question I asked about how to create momentum toward a destination with respect to development or redevelopment opportunities continues to be an overlapping question for me with respect to the hopefulness of changes to outcomes. And so I'm really at a conceptual crossroads with respect to the idea of how to actually get something that we can see happen, right? And to me, that really means about marshaling very focused attention toward what we often use is the language of pilot, and we often use the language of kind of project-based experiential, so if I can prove it here, I can prove it somewhere else, right? And so even in this presentation, they're like, look what happened in other places, and there's demonstration stuff. We point to other cities as well. The one, and this may not be on the assembly to figure out, but because of these conversations, it is part of what I want us to, as a city, be thinking about is where and how do we attract the actual dollars to the spaces that we want to see grow, like fundamentally. We just heard of the opportunity for vertical growth, so you have to confront the shadow question. But the earlier point of the day was we are developed already, and so there's kind of like, what else do you do now? It's like redevelopment opportunities. Well, again, I don't think there's an answer particularly, but these are the questions that I have with respect to, is there a space that could parallel the expectation of the work that the assembly is doing that then starts to really say, these are the resources we're going to go focus on. And that was my push to the home builders as well. My push to the home builders as well is fundamentally, there's not one building. Oh, here's a better question. How much does it cost to change the character of a neighborhood? Because we get into the nitty gritty of like the 1 foot setback from a garage to the other part, and that's a very heavy thing at that operational level. But fundamentally, there's very few actual one developments that are going to change the character of anything in our community to the point that we are built. And so we are at that place, unless we are focusing on a fundamental redevelopment picture. Because my point to the home builders is, what picture are we all working on to drive capital into our community? Or are we just at a development place, just still focusing on what everyone's individual opportunity can be, which is fine at the marketplace, but I just think that the municipality then should have a different focus on the goals that we can try to set an agenda for and drive resources into those places. And so that continues to be just the larger question behind all of this. Is not necessarily to buttress against this in any particular way, but it raises the question of how do we as a city get behind the engine and do something that we can actually start to champion towards. That would be just a larger development question, how we put resources to it. And those other questions of the where really matter to me. They really fundamentally matter. And we walk past B3, but the home builders called me the B3 guy because I think repeated B3 so many times as like, this is a great area that today there's opportunity for. Why can't we activate that today? what are those barriers? And if it's only financial, then what are, how do we get some ball rolling? And again, I don't think there's necessarily answers, but these are the types of questions that I hope get instigated from the work that you all are doing, so that people can get behind and create really momentum towards an outcome or outcomes that we want to see.
I recently read back through, it's been sitting on my desk forever, but AARP put together a pamphlet on ADUs that was it was awesome. But they highlighted in Juneau that there's like a fund that the government will support people. They'll give them some financial assistance if they're adding an ADU to their house. So that was kind of interesting.
So on that note, we can move to the next item on our agenda, but I would say one of the items on the legislative, the update for 2024, if you flip the page, we've reorganized how it reads. So it should read a little more to the bucket of what we can understand we're looking at versus just a long running list. So I thought that was important. I hope folks kind of look at how it reads, and can we get the second page?
Yeah, sorry.
I thought that's what was happening. And then give me any feedback on that. But we do have a pool of a little bit of money that the Assembly did appropriate to real estate. And I have had at least preliminary conversations with real estate director about what is that pilot project for housing activation that we have appropriated some dollars for. And the first place that I looked to refer us to was Juneau, who had been doing it for about a decade now, where their local city council, local assembly, I guess, or whatever it's called there, appropriated resources toward the instigation of activation, which is the first wave was ADUs, and they basically help people get the down payment for the ADUs, get it going. There's interest in that sort of initiative from home builders who have described, well, there are programs like that that can help them focus their attention. So I think that there's a matrix somewhere. I would love to hear ideas, and I hope to hear from Ms. Briggs to come with where their idea is so far, but I've given them some room to think about that with some suggestions, but I hope to have that conversation here and get an actual pilot of some sort moving in that direction of like we can incentivize things we want to see in our community. So, yes, Member Bronson.
So this vacant and abandoned properties is just driving me crazy. Is there we had a list of the ones that people had registered. Is there a list of ones that are actually being activated now? Because I just get so many calls from what is happening with that property. And I would love to know how many have actually been sold through real estate. They've been foreclosed and they're not just sitting, they're moving forward. I'd like to see that there's progress actually happening.
I'll speak high level, and if anyone from staff wants to intervene, I think the list is not static in that there's always kind of action on whether there's a payment, whether there's a delay, whether there's an action. But that list is maintained, from our municipal list is maintained. But I think you raised a question that I'd love an update on, which is we've appropriated money to the activation of some of the vacant and abandoned properties with the Affordable Housing and Land Trust. I think it would be a good opportunity to see which properties they have targeted, what kind of work they've done on that front. So that raises that particular question that I think I would love an update on. And then I know the update from the ACDA was that they recently applied for money from the federal government, and we're waiting to see what that response is for their initiative that would be part of also looking at those redevelopment opportunities on some of those properties. But if there's anyone from staff that wants to speak, Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is Lance Wilbur, Community Economic Development. Mr. Bronner, there's sort of two pools of money just so that we can get clear. One is the cleaning up of sort of properties that need to be cleaned up. They're not vacant and abandoned, they're just people are not taking care of their grounds. You guys have put a pool of money together. As a matter of fact, we're on Tuesday night, or maybe on the 23rd, we're going to ask you to appropriate the monies that, it's called the 205 fund. But basically, it's a pot of money the Assembly initiated a couple of years ago, and then we use those resources to clean up property, so if they're not taking care of it. And then we have properties that are basically just abandoned. And there's no one in them, or they're in probate, or it's, and they are just run down. And they are a nuisance because there's no one in them, there's illicit activity going on. So we have there's a process in which we get agreement from the individuals who's in control of either the estate or they go on the property and get their permission to sort of tear it down. A lot of that stuff, we do that. And then two things can happen. Either if the value of the land is more than it cost for us to tear it down, then we have an agreement to give the property owner the balance. The cost of the tear down is what we do, but we get their agreement to do that. They can just, in some cases, relay the property to the municipality, then we just put it out on the market. But to your question, we can get you a list on the vacant and abandoned. We can get you a list on the 9 that we've been taking down in the last, well, the ones we're just getting bids on right now. Most of them are residential lots and residential structures, relatively small. Sometimes there's abatement that's required because of what's in them, there's some nasty stuff. So we'll get you a list of probably the ones that we've torn down, the ones that we're going to tear down, and the ones that are on our list. The list is longer than that, but we can help you with all of that information. But just to be clear, we sort of have 2 pots. One is to clean up, and one is to basically take care of and put back out on the market and make them available. And that program, we've been working with not only ACDA, we've been working with folks in the construction industry, because we have some resources to take things down, but we don't have the resources to build things up. They have the resources to build, but they don't have the resources or the ability to take them down. So we're sort of working together to find out how we can put those properties basically on the market in the stock. So I'll find out more about that second part, so how that program is working.
Excellent.
But I'll initially get you the list of the ones we're cleaning, because they may be of interest, and the ones we're going to be abating. So
Where they are.
give us the time to do that. But you will see some, I think it's a $300,000 request to take it out of the capital fund, or out of that 205 fund, put it back in so we can put it, so we're going to start cleaning up property.
Ron?
So the 205 fund, my understanding that there's several properties in our area that you've done a huge cleanup several times.
Yep.
When does that end? Like, for heaven's sakes, we do not need to clean up this property 20 times.
I don't like my answer, but my answer is that if the property, we clean up the property and then the property owner owns the property, they're not breaking the law. There's a fine line about sort of, we take away washers and dryers and broken cars and things, and then there's no law that says they can't bring them back. It's frustrating for us as well because we have a lot of things to do. So
Yeah.
I'm not sure what the solution to that is, Ms.
Okay.
Pronga, but yeah, we know that. As a matter of fact, we talked about one yesterday that's back on our list that's frustrating. So we're working through it.
Okay.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Is that also part of the sub-list that we can have, the frustration repeat list? Do we know?
Let me find out if I can give you that
Oh,
list.
right. Because, good neighbors. Brown.
Yeah, one thing on the vacant and abandoned side, so Senate Bill 77 that we got a briefing from is in the House, and that is the blight bill, which is carrot and stick. It has allows cities to do more tax incentive to exempt the school district portion as well, or whatever the term is. It includes the school district portion of abatement. And then also has to do with more tools for nuisance properties. So just to say that's in-house rules, so it's waiting for a floor vote. I've heard that there's a few folks that are the Republican side that are trying to strip out the stick part of it to say cities should not, right, so they want just the one-sided. So just to say, if you have any poll with House Majority members, including Representative Craig Johnson or others, he's the rules chair, that's where it's at. And I know I talked to Senator Dunbar, the sponsor. He does not want to see that other piece stripped out because I think it's a detriment because really what I'm looking at from the city level is we have a stagnant tax base, and we have a lot of properties that are net negative to the point of using public resources to clean them up. And so I don't want to only have the ability to do more tax write-offs without the other ability to deal with those properties and really hold property owners accountable for causing public nuisances, essentially, and nuisances for their neighbors. So anyway, just to say, hopefully that passes this year, but that's where it is. And so and I know we, the city, have been clear about our position on it, so.
Ms. Hartman?
Yeah, I have some additions wearing my hat with Legislative Services, because what it sounded like you were speaking to, Mr. Chair, was a desire to focus the community on building momentum towards the vision for abundant housing in the municipality. And at the Housing Summit in the fall, I had the opportunity to speak with Lance about when you all are working on a legislative project like making 3 and 4plexes easier, more affordable to build, how does that work translate to more units being developed? And for my part, I think no small part of that is communication and telling people that it's easier now than ever before to do this type of work. And so just wanted to flag that you all appropriated funds for communication support around your Housing Action Initiative and the Housing Action Plan. And so as of this week, we've brought on Rising Tide Communications. Legislative Services meets regularly with community partners like ACDA. And so what I'm picturing at this point is kind of a coming together of all this work around housing action to hopefully centralize and then also distribute this information in a way that is meeting the public where they're at, so that they see that the time and energy focused on housing action is paying off, that there's something to be seen for it. And so these questions about, how is this project doing, or what's the latest on this amount of data that we have? Ross and the I team are doing some really great work to develop a housing permit dashboard that reflects what permitting looks like over the years, right? And so all of that, I think, is an opportunity to bring that information together and present it to the public. So we're moving on it. Would love to talk with assembly members if you have ideas for what that looks like. And then we had really great engagement in the community around Housing Action Week, people submitting op-eds and having conversations in many publications and even national coverage. So all of that, I think, is part of the equation as well. And so thank you for the opportunity to work on it, for putting resources towards that end. And I'm really excited about working with the administration to make sure that you all feel supported in that too.
Excellent. Thank you, Ms. Hartman, for that perspective and update as well. And I do want to just flag, what you described, Mr. Wilbur, is exactly the hope of strategic alignment with the various stakeholders and players, and like the routinized nature of like focusing the attention. I think that's exactly what I hope to hear from us and continue to work toward. And so I appreciate that. And then I just wanted to flag back to the list, at least for us today. I want to encourage members to look through this, see what's missing. I already know one that I have added. Earlier, before the start of the meeting, we were having a side conversation about recent vacations. And it raised the obviousness for me, which is like, why is that not part of our committee's regular discussion about the investments in tourism, economy, and the other parts of that? So we were talking about the cultural ecotourism, we're talking about nightlife. That was a recent thing with the Anchorage Music Cities. So there's all of this kind of stuff that really is about staying a little longer, going a little further, and in the conversation of Choose Anchorage. I think there's a great opportunity for us to look at that and to have that on our radar as well. I heard a little bit about the dashboard. That was something that early on we talked about. I think that transparency and the activity, I think, is really important. And to your point, Ms. Hartman, the stories of the successes, I think, are really important for us to tell. And there lies the opportunity, Mr. Wilbur, with what we want out of those relationships, so that if we're doing partnerships, public-private partnerships, I think we get to drive the goals toward the objectives that we as policymakers are setting. And so the type of housing, the type of things we want to see happening in our community. And that to me really is like, then I pictured Ms. Hartman's story saying, they wanted to build this little thing, they were able to, And because it was part of a program that the municipality had a hand in through the raising or whatever it was, the setting the table for the developers, whatever it was, they were able to accomplish that because all of these wonderful changes, and look what you can do in Anchorage, you can still dream. I would imagine that that's a great video to try to drive home the point, like look what's happening in Anchorage. If the policies and the outcomes can match that picture, I think we're moving in the right direction, and I think we're moving in the right direction with all of your work. So I'll pause there. I don't necessarily need to go through all these other ones today, but I encourage you to do it. I just translated from our other list, and feel free to add as we go along. Are there any members of the public here that would want to make any public comments? Mr. Schutte.
Thank you. I'll make one that puts Assemblymember Brawley on the spot. Yesterday and the day before were infrastructure symposiums hosted by AML with a housing focus this year, underwritten by Housing Alaskans. Great panels, and Assemblymember Brawley served on one yesterday, along with representatives from from Valdez and other communities, and Sitka. Thank you. I was blanking on that. Those two little communities, so we talked a lot about Juneau today and some of the economic incentives and actual financial investment they're making. Valdez had a great story about some new initiatives that they put in place as well. Things ranging from a sort of undefined infrastructure grant program that allows developers to apply for grants to do offsite infrastructure, as well as a $10,000 per unit housing incentive fund designed to get folks who have developable land, residential land, to do something with it. So maybe, Anna, we can lean on you to get the AML presentations to this group. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I will note too, that incentive, I heard them say that, and then I thought, oh man, that must be nice to have oil money, that you can just do $1 million programs like that. So,
Yeah.
in the context of the budget discussion we're having. But I think, it's a cool idea.
Thank you, Mr. Schutte.
Thank you.
I don't see any members here in person. Any members of the public on the phone?
I'm sorry, didn't be smart.
All right, yeah, we'll be fine with that.
That's it.
Yeah.
He's hiding.
Low key today, but we'll adjourn now at 10:29. Thank you, everyone.